My daughter-in-law locked me in a 40 SQFT room and said, "This is where you'll live now." So I sold the entire house while she was out shopping for curtains. I'm glad to have you here. Follow my story until the end and comment the city you're watching from so I can see how far my story has reached. My name is Ramona, and at 60 years old, I thought I knew what family meant. I thought blood was thicker than water, that your children would always have your back, especially when you'd sacrificed everything for them. I was wrong about so many things. It started 3 months after Harold's funeral. The house felt enormous without him, every room echoing with memories of our 42 years together. Sterling, my only son, had been calling more frequently since the service. At first, I thought it was grief bringing us closer. He'd ask about my health, whether I was eating properly, if I felt safe living alone in our old Victorian house. "Mom, Zariah and I have been talking," he said during one of his visits in late September. He sat across from me in Harold's old recliner, his hands fidgeting with his wedding ring. "We think you should come live with us." I looked up from the photo album I'd been organizing, pictures of Sterling as a child scattered across the coffee table. "That's sweet of you both, but I'm managing just fine here." "Are you, though?" Sterling leaned forward, his voice taking on that concerned tone I'd heard him use with his clients at the insurance firm. "Mrs. Patterson next door told Zariah she's worried about you. Says you've been forgetting to bring in your mail, leaving lights on all night." My chest tightened. Eleanor Patterson had always been a gossip, but hearing that she'd been reporting on me to my daughter-in-law felt like a betrayal. "I've been distracted, that's all." "It's normal after losing someone you've loved for so long." "Of course it is," Sterling said quickly. "But why struggle alone when you have family? Zariah's been talking about converting the guest room just for you. She's excited about having another woman in the house." The way he said it made something in my stomach twist. Zariah excited about anything involving me seemed unlikely. In the 8 years since Sterling married her, our relationship had been cordial at best. She was polite during holiday gatherings, remembered my birthday with generic cards, but there was always a distance, a coolness that made me feel like an outsider looking in at my own son's life. "I don't know, Sterling. This house has so many memories." "Mom." He reached over and took my hand, his touch gentle but firm. "Dad wouldn't want you struggling here alone. You know that." The mention of Harold hit its mark. I blinked back tears, remembering how my husband used to worry about what would happen to me if something happened to him. "He always said you'd take care of me," I whispered. "And I will. We will." Sterling squeezed my hand. "Zariah's already started planning how to make the space perfect for you. She wants you to feel completely at home." 2 weeks later, I found myself standing in Sterling and Zariah's driveway, watching movers carry the remnants of my life into their split-level house. I'd sold most of the furniture, Harold's recliner, our dining room set, the king-size bed where we'd spent so many peaceful nights. Only my most precious belongings made the journey. Photos, Harold's books, my mother's china, and a few pieces of clothing. Zariah emerged from the house wearing a flowing sundress and a smile that seemed almost genuine. At 35, she was stunning in that effortless way some women possessed. Long auburn hair that caught the sunlight, green eyes that sparkled when she spoke to Sterling, and a figure that hadn't changed since their wedding day. "Ramona," she called out, arms extended as if we were long-lost friends rather than in-laws who barely knew each other. "Welcome home." The embrace she pulled me into smelled like expensive perfume and felt surprisingly warm. For a moment, I wondered if I'd misjudged her all these years. "Thank you for opening your home to me," I said when she released me. "I know having a mother-in-law move in can't be easy." "Nonsense," Zariah waved her hand dismissively. "I've always wanted a mother figure around. My own mother passed when I was 23, you know. Cancer." I'd forgotten that detail about Zariah's past. The wave of sympathy that washed over me made me feel guilty for all the times I'd questioned her motives or felt excluded from their lives. "The movers are almost finished," Sterling said, appearing beside us with a clipboard. "Should we show Mom her new room?" "Oh, yes." Zariah clapped her hands together like an excited child. "I've been working on it for weeks. I really hope you'll love what I've done with the space." We walked through the house, past the spacious living room with its vaulted ceilings and enormous windows, through the modern kitchen with granite countertops and stainless steel appliances. Everything was perfectly coordinated in shades of cream and sage green, like something from a home decorating magazine. "The guest bathroom is right here," Zariah said, gesturing to a door off the main hallway. "You'll have complete privacy." "And here's your room," Sterling announced, stopping at the end of the hallway. Zariah opened the door with a flourish, stepping aside so I could enter first. Ta-da! I stepped through the doorway and stopped dead. The space couldn't have been more than 40 square feet. A narrow twin bed was pushed against one wall, with barely enough room to walk around it. A small dresser was wedged into the corner, and a single window looked out onto the neighbor's fence. "It's cozy," I managed to say, my voice sounding strange even to my own ears. "I wanted to make sure you felt secure," Zariah said, moving around me to smooth the bedspread. "Small spaces can be so comforting, don't you think? Like a cocoon." I stared at the room, trying to reconcile what I was seeing with what Sterling had described. This wasn't a converted guest room. This looked like a space that had been deliberately minimized, stripped down to the absolute basics. "Where will I put my clothes?" I asked, looking at the tiny dresser. "Oh, there's a closet." Zariah opened what I'd assumed was a door to the hallway. Inside was a space barely wide enough for hangers, maybe 2 feet deep. Perfect for the essentials. Sterling was looking around the room with a slight frown, as if seeing it for the first time. "It does seem a bit smaller than I expected." "It's exactly what we discussed," Zariah said quickly, moving to his side and taking his arm. "Remember, we talked about how older people feel more secure in intimate spaces. It's actually recommended by geriatric specialists." I felt something cold settle in my stomach. Had they really discussed me like I was a patient rather than a person? Like someone whose preferences and comfort didn't matter as long as their geriatric needs were met? "Of course," I said, forcing a smile. "It's very thoughtful of you both." But as I stood in that tiny room, surrounded by the few possessions I'd been able to bring from my real home, I felt something I hadn't experienced since I was a child, living under my father's strict rules. The feeling of being small, powerless, and completely at someone else's mercy. "Well," Zariah said, clapping her hands together again, "I'll let you get settled. Dinner's at 6 sharp. We keep a regular schedule in this house. I'm sure you understand the importance of routine at your age." She swept out of the room, leaving Sterling and me alone. My son looked uncomfortable, shifting his weight from foot to foot. "Mom, if you're not happy with this arrangement—" "It's fine," I interrupted, not trusting my voice to remain steady if I said more. "I'm grateful to have family who cares about me." Sterling nodded, but his eyes didn't quite meet mine. "We'll make this work, Mom. I promise." After he left, I sat on the narrow bed and looked around my new world. 40 square feet. I'd raised Sterling in a house with over 2,000 square feet, worked double shifts as a nurse to pay the mortgage, sacrificed vacations and new clothes, and so many small luxuries to make sure he never wanted for anything. And this was where that love and sacrifice had brought me. I unpacked my few belongings, hanging my dresses in the impossibly narrow closet, arranging Harold's books on top of the small dresser. When I tried to close the dresser drawers, they stuck because there wasn't enough room for them to open fully. That night at dinner, I sat at their beautiful dining table, feeling like a stranger in my own son's home. Zariah served a perfectly prepared salmon with asparagus, chattering brightly about her day, her book club, her plans to redecorate the living room. "We should probably discuss house rules," she said as she cleared the plates. "Not rules, really. Just guidelines to make sure we all live harmoniously together." "Of course," I said, though something in her tone made my shoulders tense. "Nothing complicated," Zariah continued, her voice light and reasonable. "Just things like quiet hours after 9 p.m. since Sterling has early meetings, and we'll need to coordinate bathroom times in the mornings. I have my skincare routine, you understand." I nodded, watching Sterling focus intently on his coffee cup. "Oh, and I should mention, the main living areas are really designed for entertaining. Sterling's colleagues come by quite often, and we want to maintain a certain aesthetic. But your room is so comfortable, I'm sure you'll love spending time there. The meaning was clear, even wrapped in polite words. I was to stay in my tiny room when company came over. I was to be invisible, hidden away like an embarrassing secret. This is where you'll live now, Zariah said, her green eyes meeting mine across the table. Her smile never wavered, but something in her gaze had changed. Gone was the warmth from earlier, replaced by something cold and calculating. I do hope you'll be happy here. As I lay in that narrow bed that first night, listening to the unfamiliar sounds of a house that wasn't mine, I finally understood the truth. This hadn't been Sterling's idea at all. This was Zariah's plan, and somehow she'd convinced my son that confining his mother to a space smaller than most people's walk-in closets was an act of love and care. I stared at the ceiling in the darkness, Harold's wedding ring still on my finger, and wondered what my husband would think of the woman his son had married. More importantly, I wondered what he would think of the man our son had become. But I had no idea that this was only the beginning. The woman lying in the master bedroom down the hall had plans for me that went far beyond a tiny room and house rules. And tomorrow, I would start to discover just how far she was willing to go to make sure I understood exactly where I stood in this family hierarchy. The first week in Zariah's house taught me more about power dynamics than 40 years of marriage ever had. It started with small things, requests disguised as suggestions, boundaries presented as loving concern. "Ramona, sweetie," Zariah said on my third morning there, finding me making coffee in the kitchen at 7 a.m. She was already perfectly dressed in yoga pants and a fitted top, her hair pulled back in a sleek ponytail. "I meant to mention earlier, Sterling and I usually have our morning routine together before he leaves for work. It's really important for our marriage, you understand." I looked around the spacious kitchen, confused. "Of course. I'll just grab my coffee and—" "Actually," she interrupted gently, "it would be wonderful if you could have your breakfast in your room during the week, just until 8:30 or so. That way we can maintain our privacy, and you won't have to worry about being in the way." Being in the way. The words stung more than they should have. I'd been making breakfast in kitchens for 60 years, but suddenly I was an inconvenience in my own son's home. "Of course," I said, pouring my coffee into a travel mug. "I understand completely." But as I retreated to my tiny room with my coffee and a piece of toast, I couldn't shake the feeling that I'd just been politely dismissed from my own family. The bathroom schedule came next. Zariah presented it to me that evening as if it were a completely reasonable solution to a problem I hadn't known existed. "I've made us a little chart," she said, producing a laminated schedule from her purse, "just so we can all get ready without bumping into each other." According to the chart, I had access to the bathroom from 6 to 6:30 a.m., 12 to 12:30 p.m., and 8 to 8:30 p.m. 3 30-minute windows to handle all my personal needs. "What if I need to use the bathroom outside these times?" I asked, studying the schedule. "Oh, well, there's a powder room off the laundry area," Zariah said brightly. "It's a bit small, but it has everything you need." I found the powder room later that evening. It was barely larger than an airplane bathroom, with no window and a single bare bulb for lighting. The toilet was so close to the wall that I had to sit sideways. This was where I was expected to handle my most basic human needs for most of the day. But the real revelation came when I tried to visit my grandchildren. Sterling had 2 kids from his first marriage, Emma, age 10, and Jake, age 7. They lived with their mother most of the time, but spent every other weekend with Sterling and Zariah. I've been looking forward to being able to see them more often, maybe help with homework or bake cookies together like I'd done when they were smaller. "Oh, that's so sweet that you want to spend time with them," Zariah said when I mentioned it, "but I should probably explain how we handle visits here." She led me to the living room where children's toys were noticeably absent, despite the fact that Emma and Jake would be arriving the next day. "We've worked really hard to create a calm, adult environment," she explained, settling gracefully onto the cream-colored sofa. "The children have their activities scheduled, swimming lessons, tutoring, play dates. They're really too busy to just hang around the house. But surely they have some downtime. When they do, we find it's best if they can focus on Sterling. He gets so little time with them as it is." Zariah's voice was sympathetic, but her message was clear. I'm sure you understand. You wouldn't want to interfere with their father-child bonding time. I felt something crack inside my chest. Those children were my grandchildren, and I was being told I couldn't spend time with them in case I interfered with their relationship with their father, my own son. Where do they play when they're here? I asked, looking around the pristine living room. Oh, they have a lovely playroom in the basement, very cozy and contained. That way they can be as loud as they want without disturbing the rest of the house. Contained, like me in my 40-square-foot room. Like everyone and everything in Zariah's perfectly controlled world. That weekend, I caught glimpses of Emma and Jake as they moved through the house like small ghosts, shuttled from one scheduled activity to another. When Emma tried to show me a drawing she'd made, Zariah quickly redirected her. Grandma Ramona is resting, sweetheart. Why don't you show that to Daddy when he gets back from the hardware store? I wasn't resting. I was sitting in the living room reading a book, perfectly available to admire my granddaughter's artwork. But Emma nodded obediently and disappeared back down to the basement. By the end of my second week, I'd begun to understand the true nature of my situation. I wasn't a beloved family member who'd been welcomed into my son's home. I was an inconvenience being managed, controlled, and hidden away whenever possible. The breaking point came when I tried to do my own laundry. I'd been wearing the same clothes for several days, rotating between the few items that fit in the tiny dresser. When I gathered up my dirty clothes and headed for the laundry room, Zariah intercepted me in the hallway. Oh, you don't need to worry about that, she said, taking the bundle from my arms. I handle all the household tasks. It's easier to keep everything on schedule that way. I've been doing my own laundry for 60 years, I said, reaching for my clothes. I think I can manage. Zariah's smile tightened almost imperceptibly. Of course you can. But we have a specific system here. Certain detergents for certain fabrics, water temperatures that protect the machine. I'd hate for anything to get damaged. She was treating me like a child who couldn't be trusted with basic tasks. Worse, she was doing it with such sweetness that objecting would make me look ungrateful and difficult. When will I get my clothes back? I asked. Oh, by the end of the week, probably. I like to do full loads to save water. The end of the week, I was expected to wear the same outfit for 5 more days, because Zariah had decided my laundry wasn't a priority. That night, I lay in my narrow bed listening to Sterling and Zariah's voices through the thin walls. I couldn't make out specific words, but I could hear the rhythm of their conversation, Zariah's animated tones punctuated by Sterling's occasional responses. Were they talking about me? Was Sterling sharing details about how I was adjusting to my new living situation? Did he even see what was happening to me? Or had Zariah's manipulation been so subtle that he genuinely believed this was normal? I thought about Harold, about how he would have reacted if anyone had tried to treat me this way. He would have been furious. He would have demanded answers, insisted on changes, protected me from anyone who tried to diminish my dignity. But Harold was gone, and I was alone with a son who seemed blind to his wife's cruelty and a daughter-in-law who was systematically erasing me from my own family. The next morning, I decided to do something I hadn't done since moving in. I explored the house while Zariah was out at her yoga class. I started with the obvious places, the kitchen cabinets, looking for where she might keep important papers. Then I moved to the home office, a room I'd been told was off-limits because Sterling worked from home sometimes. What I found in the desk drawer changed everything. It was a folder labeled Family Planning in Zariah's neat handwriting. Inside were printouts about elderly care facilities, articles about signs of dementia in seniors, and a business card for something called Senior Transition Services. But it was the handwritten notes that made my blood run cold. R shows signs of confusion, forgetfulness, neighbors concerned about ability to live independently. S agrees intervention necessary. The date on the note was from 2 weeks before Sterling had first suggested I move in with them. My hands shook as I read further. There were detailed observations about my behavior, my habits, my supposed inability to care for myself, all written in Zariah's careful script, all painting a picture of a woman in cognitive decline who needed constant supervision. The most damning entry was recent. R adapting well to structured environment. Responds positively to clear boundaries and limited decision-making responsibilities. May be ready for next phase by Christmas. Next phase. What was the next phase? I flipped through more papers and found my answer. Brochures for assisted living facilities, all within a 50-mile radius. All expensive, all featuring pictures of smiling elderly residents engaged in carefully supervised activities. At the bottom of the pile was a printed email exchange between Zariah and someone at Sterling's insurance company discussing long-term care coverage for elderly dependent family members. She wasn't just controlling me. She was building a case to have me declared incompetent and removed from their home entirely. Every rule, every restriction, every time she treated me like a confused child, it was all part of a calculated plan to prove I couldn't take care of myself. I photographed everything with my phone, my hands trembling so badly I had to take several shots to get clear images. Then I carefully replaced the papers exactly as I'd found them and crept back to my tiny room. Sitting on my narrow bed, I stared at the photos on my phone and felt something I hadn't experienced in years. Pure, cold rage. Zariah thought she was dealing with a helpless old woman who could be manipulated and discarded at will. She thought I would go quietly into whatever next phase she had planned for me. She was about to learn how wrong she was, because while she'd been busy building her case against me, she'd made one crucial mistake. She'd underestimated exactly who she was dealing with. I wasn't just Sterling's aging mother who needed care and supervision. I was a woman who had survived an abusive father, put herself through nursing school, raised a child alone while working double shifts, and managed a household budget through recessions and financial crises. I was a woman who had outlived a husband I loved and found the strength to keep going. And I was about to show my son's wife exactly what that kind of strength looked like when it was pushed too far. The discovery of Zariah's folder changed everything. For 3 days, I moved through her house like a different person, compliant on the surface but calculating underneath. I smiled when she explained new rules about not using the good towels. I nodded when she suggested I might be more comfortable eating my meals in my room. I even thanked her when she informed me that the living room would be off limits during her book club meetings because elderly people can sometimes say inappropriate things without realizing it. But inside, I was planning. The first step was understanding exactly what legal ground I stood on. Harold had been meticulous about our finances, and I knew there were documents I needed to review. The problem was that most of our important papers were still in the safety deposit box at First National Bank, a box that was in both our names. On Thursday morning, while Zariah was at her Pilates class, I called the bank. "Mrs. Mitchell, how nice to hear from you," said Janet, the customer service representative who'd handled our accounts for 15 years. "How are you settling in with your son's family?" "Very well, thank you," I lied smoothly. "I need to access our safety deposit box. Are there any restrictions since Harold passed?" "None at all. You're listed as a joint holder with full access rights. Would you like to schedule an appointment?" "Actually, I was hoping to come in this afternoon. Would 2 o'clock work?" "Perfect. I'll have everything ready for you." I hung up and immediately called a taxi. Zariah had made it clear that I was expected to ask permission before leaving the house, but I wasn't about to let her know what I was planning. The taxi ride to the bank felt like a journey back to my real life. For 40 minutes, I wasn't the diminished woman living in a 40-square-foot room. I was Ramona Mitchell, widow, mother, and a person with rights and resources that extended far beyond Zariah's controlled environment. At the bank, Janet led me to the safety deposit box room with genuine warmth. I was so sorry to hear about Harold's passing. He was such a gentleman. "Thank you, he really was." Inside the box were the documents that represented our life, together: the deed to our old house, our wills, insurance policies, and investment statements. But it was Harold's final letter to me that made my breath catch. He'd written it just months before his death, when his diagnosis had made the future uncertain. In his careful handwriting, he'd outlined everything I needed to know about our finances, including details I'd forgotten. "Ramona, my darling," the letter began, "if you're reading this, then I'm no longer there to protect you. But I've made sure you'll never be dependent on anyone else's charity. You are a strong, capable woman who deserves respect and dignity always. Don't let anyone convince you otherwise. He'd been right about our finances. The sale of our house had netted $320,000, which I'd deposited in a savings account. But there were other assets I'd overlooked. His pension benefits, which would continue paying me $1,800 a month for life, and a life insurance policy worth $150,000 that had already been processed. More importantly, Harold had purchased long-term care insurance for both of us years earlier. The policy would cover up to $5,000 a month for in-home care or assisted living, but only if I needed it and only if I chose it. No one could force me into care against my will as long as I was mentally competent. I photographed every relevant document, then carefully returned everything to the box. As I walked back through the bank lobby, I felt like I was waking up from a nightmare. I wasn't powerless. I wasn't dependent. I had options that Zariah couldn't control or manipulate. The taxi dropped me back at the house just as Zariah was returning from her class. She emerged from her BMW with a yoga mat tucked under her arm, looking every inch the perfect suburban wife. "Ramona, where have you been?" Her voice was light, but there was an edge to it that hadn't been there before. "Just running a small errand," I said, smiling pleasantly. "You should have told me you needed to go somewhere. I could have driven you." "That's very kind, but I didn't want to interrupt your class." Zariah's green eyes narrowed slightly. "In the future, it would be better if you let me know when you're planning to leave. We worry about you, you know. Senior citizens can become disoriented in unfamiliar places." There it was again, the subtle suggestion that I was incompetent, that I needed supervision and protection. But now I knew exactly what she was building toward. "Of course, I said. I'll be sure to check with you next time." That evening, I began researching my options online using the small laptop I'd brought from home. I was careful to delete my search history afterward, but what I learned filled me with a cold satisfaction. First, I contacted Harold's attorney, Michael Chen, who had helped us draft our wills. His secretary scheduled an appointment for the following week, and I made sure to arrange it during Zariah's regular gym time. Second, I researched property laws in our state. What I discovered was fascinating. Sterling and Zariah's house was purchased 8 years ago for $420,000. They'd put down 20% and taken out a 30-year mortgage. According to public records, they still owed approximately $280,000. But here's what made my pulse quicken. Harold had co-signed their mortgage. When Sterling was going through his divorce and his credit was damaged, Harold had stepped in to help them qualify for the loan. As a co-signer, Harold, and now I, had certain legal protections regarding the property. More importantly, Harold had also provided $50,000 toward their down payment, money that was documented as a loan, not a gift. The paperwork was buried in our financial records, but it was there, signed and notarized. Sterling and Zariah owed my husband's estate $50,000, plus 8 years of interest. I spent the weekend observing them with new eyes, watching how they interacted when they thought I wasn't paying attention. What I saw confirmed my worst suspicions. On Saturday evening, while I was supposedly napping in my room, I heard them talking in the kitchen. The walls in this house were thinner than they'd realized. "She seems more confused lately," Zariah was saying. "Yesterday she couldn't remember where she'd put her reading glasses, and this morning she asked me the same question about dinner twice." "Really?" Sterling's voice sounded concerned. "Maybe we should have her evaluated." "I've been thinking the same thing. Dr. Patterson, Eleanor's nephew who specializes in geriatric care, he's agreed to do a home visit. Very discreet." My blood ran cold. Dr. Patterson? Eleanor's nephew. The same Eleanor who had been worried about me and had reported her concerns to Zariah. This was all connected, a network of people who had decided my fate without ever consulting me. "When were you thinking?" Sterling asked. "Next week, while she's settled into the routine. He said it's better to observe patients in their living environment to get a true picture of their capabilities. And if he finds problems, then we'll know we made the right choice moving her here, and we'll be able to take the next steps with confidence." I pressed my ear closer to the wall, straining to hear more. The Willowbrook facility has a wonderful reputation, Zariah continued. I've already spoken with their admissions coordinator. They have an opening coming up in December, but we'd need to move quickly if we want to secure it. December. Less than 2 months away. They were planning to have me declared incompetent and institutionalized by Christmas. I crept back to my bed, my mind racing. Everything made sense now. The tiny room, the restrictions, the careful documentation of my supposed confusion and forgetfulness. Zariah wasn't just trying to control me. She was building a legal case to have me removed entirely. But she made one crucial error in her calculations. She assumed I was isolated, friendless, and completely dependent on their version of events. She had no idea that I'd been documenting everything too, photographing her folder, recording dates and incidents, building my own case. On Monday morning, I called Michael Chen's office and moved up my appointment to that afternoon. When Zariah left for her yoga class, I took another taxi to his office building downtown. Michael had aged in the 2 years since Harold's funeral, his hair now completely silver, but his mind was as sharp as ever. He listened carefully as I explained my situation, occasionally taking notes but never interrupting. Harold mentioned some concerns about Sterling's marriage. He said when I finished, he worried that Zariah might try to manipulate the family finances if something happened to him. He was right to worry. Michael pulled out a thick file folder. Your husband was very thorough in protecting your interests. Let me show you something you might not be aware of. He spread several documents across his mahogany desk. Harold established a revocable trust 6 months before he died. Your house, your investments, even the loan to Sterling, everything is protected. More importantly, Harold included specific provisions about your care. I leaned forward, studying the papers. According to the trust documents, any decisions about your living situation must be made by you and you alone, while you're mentally competent. No family member can override your choices. And if anyone attempts to manipulate or coerce you regarding your care, they forfeit any inheritance rights they might have had. Sterling doesn't know about this? Harold wanted to tell him, but he passed before he had the chance. He asked me to explain everything to you first, then help you decide how to proceed. Michael pulled out another document. There's more. Harold suspected that Zariah might try to claim financial hardship to justify controlling your resources. So he had an investigation done into their actual financial situation. The report he handed me was eye-opening. Sterling and Zariah weren't struggling financially. Sterling's insurance business was doing well, generating over $120,000 annually. Zariah had her own income from a trust fund left by her grandmother, nearly $40,000 a year that she'd never mentioned to anyone in the family. They didn't need my money or my house sale proceeds. They simply wanted control. What are my options? I asked. Michael smiled, and for the first time in weeks, I felt like I had an ally. More than you might think. Much more. As he outlined the possibilities, I felt something I hadn't experienced since Harold's death. Power. Real power. Backed by law and protected by my husband's foresight, Zariah thought she was playing chess with someone who didn't know the rules. She was about to discover that not only did I know how to play, but I'd been holding the winning pieces all along. The game was about to change, and this time, I would be the one making the moves. The plan I developed with Michael Chen was elegant in its simplicity. Zariah had spent weeks building a case against me, documenting my supposed incompetence while positioning herself as my caring protector. She convinced Sterling that I needed supervision, that I was confused and forgetful, that I couldn't be trusted to make important decisions. She was about to learn exactly how wrong she was. Michael had explained the legal situation in terms that left no room for misunderstanding. As Harold's widow and the beneficiary of his estate, I had certain rights regarding the loan he'd made to Sterling and Zariah. The $50,000 down payment assistance had been documented as a loan with specific terms. If the borrowers defaulted on the mortgage payments, or if the co-signer's estate requested early repayment, the full amount became immediately due. More importantly, Harold's position as co-signer gave his estate, meaning me, legal standing in any decisions about the property. The house couldn't be sold, refinanced, or transferred without my written consent. But Zariah didn't know any of this. She'd never bothered to read the fine print of the financial arrangements Harold had made to help them buy their dream home. She'd simply assumed that once Harold was gone, those complications would disappear. The beauty of my plan was his timing. Zariah had mentioned several times that she was planning a major redecorating project for the fall. She'd been researching new curtains for the living room, something about updating the aesthetic before the holiday season. She'd scheduled a shopping trip to the design center in the city for Thursday afternoon, a trip that would take her away from the house for at least 4 hours. On Wednesday evening, I put the final pieces in place. "I've been thinking about our conversation," I told Sterling during dinner, carefully choosing my words. "About having Dr. Patterson come evaluate me." Sterling looked up from his plate, surprise flickering across his face. "Oh, well, I mean, it's just a precaution." "I understand," I interrupted gently. "And I think it's wise. I have been feeling a bit scattered lately. It would be good to have a professional assessment." Zariah's fork paused halfway to her mouth. "Really? You're open to that?" "Of course. I want what's best for everyone. If I'm becoming a burden, I need to know." "You're not a burden, Mom," Sterling said quickly, but I could see the relief in his eyes. He genuinely believed this was the right choice, that he was protecting me from myself. "I was wondering," I continued, "would it be possible to schedule the appointment for Friday? I'd like to have the rest of the week to prepare myself mentally." "That's very mature of you," Zariah said, her voice warm with what sounded like genuine approval. "I'll call Dr. Patterson's office tomorrow and see what we can arrange." Perfect. By Friday, it wouldn't matter what Dr. Patterson concluded about my mental state. Thursday morning dawned clear and crisp, with the kind of autumn sunshine that made everything seem possible. I watched from my tiny window as Zariah loaded fabric samples and paint chips into her BMW, chattering excitedly about her decorating plans. "I should be back by 6, she called to Sterling as he headed to his car. "The design center has some new collections I want to see. This might take longer than I thought." "Take your time," Sterling called back. "I've got client meetings all afternoon anyway." I waited until both cars had disappeared down the street, then I made my first call. "Michael, it's Ramona. Are you ready?" "Everything's in place," he confirmed. "The buyers are standing by and the title company has all the paperwork prepared." "Are you sure about this?" I've never been more sure of anything in my life. My second call was to Janet at the bank. "I need to access my safety deposit box again, and I'll need a cashier's check prepared." "Of course, Mrs. Mitchell. What amount?" $57,412. The exact amount of the loan Sterling and Zariah owed Harold's estate, plus 8 years of accrued interest at the rate specified in the original agreement. "I'll have that ready for you." The third call was to Tom Bradley, a real estate agent Harold and I had used years earlier when we'd briefly considered downsizing. Tom had stayed in touch, occasionally sending us market updates and holiday cards. "Ramona, how are you holding up?" "I'm doing well, Tom. I need a favor, and I need it handled very quietly." "What can I do for you?" "I need you to list a property for immediate sale. I have cash buyers interested, and we need to close today if possible." There was a pause. "Today? That's unusual, but not impossible if all parties are motivated. What's the property?" I gave him Sterling and Zariah's address. "Wait," Tom said slowly. "Isn't that your son's house? The one Harold co-signed for?" "It is, and as Harold's widow and the estate beneficiary, I have the legal right to call in the loan and force a sale if necessary, to recover the debt." Another pause, longer this time. "Ramona, are you sure about this? This seems like something that could cause family problems." "Tom, the family problems started the day they decided to treat me like an incompetent old woman who could be manipulated and discarded. I'm just evening the playing field." "All right then. If you're certain this is what you want to do, I'll make it happen. But I'll need documentation of your legal standing." "Michael Chen is handling the legal aspects. He'll send you everything you need within the hour." By noon, everything was in motion. Tom had 3 potential buyers lined up, investors who specialized in quick closings for properties in desirable neighborhoods. Michael had filed the necessary paperwork to exercise the estate's rights under the co-signer agreement. The title company was prepared to handle an emergency closing. At 2 o'clock, while Zariah was presumably selecting curtains for a house she was about to lose, I signed the paperwork that would change all our lives. The buyers were a young couple with excellent credit and cash for a down payment. They'd been looking for a house in this exact neighborhood for months. When Tom explained that they could close immediately if they were willing to pay full asking price, they didn't hesitate. $450,000. $28,000 more than Sterling and Zariah had paid 8 years earlier, and enough to pay off their outstanding mortgage with money left over. The beauty of the transaction was its complete legality. As co-signer on the original mortgage and creditor for the unpaid loan, Harold's estate had the right to force a sale to recover the debt. Sterling and Zariah would receive the proceeds after the mortgage and loan repayment, but they would no longer own the house. More importantly, they would no longer have any authority over me or my living situation. By 4 o'clock, it was done. The new owners had the keys, the mortgage was satisfied, and Sterling and Zariah owed me nothing. They also had no home to return to. I spent the remaining time carefully packing my belongings into the 2 suitcases I'd brought from my old life. Everything fit easily, all the possessions I'd been allowed to keep in my 40-square-foot prison. At 5:30, I called a taxi and left a letter on the kitchen counter. Sterling arrived home first at 6:15. I watched from across the street where I was waiting in the taxi as he pulled into the driveway and noticed the unfamiliar car parked there. I saw him approach the front door, try his key, and realize it didn't work anymore. The new owners, Mark and Jennifer, a lovely couple in their 30s, answered his knock with polite confusion. I couldn't hear the conversation from that distance, but I could see Sterling's growing agitation as the truth began to dawn on him. Zariah's BMW turned the corner just as Sterling was pulling out his phone, probably trying to call me. She parked behind the strange car, several shopping bags visible in her back seat, the curtains she'd bought for a house that was no longer hers. What followed was exactly what I'd expected. Shock, disbelief, and then anger as they realized what had happened. They stood in their former driveway, arguing with each other and gesturing at the house while Mark and Jennifer watched nervously from the front door. I instructed the taxi driver to pull forward then. As we approached the driveway, I rolled down my window. "Sterling," I called out. "Zariah." They turned toward me, their faces displaying a range of emotions I'd never seen before. Sterling looked devastated. Zariah looked furious. "Mom, what the hell is going on?" Sterling demanded, striding toward the taxi. "These people are saying they bought our house? That can't be right." "It's absolutely right," I replied calmly. "I exercise the estate's legal right to call in your loan and force a sale to recover the debt." "What debt?" Zariah snapped. "We don't owe you anything." I pulled out a copy of the original loan agreement, the one Harold had insisted on when he'd provided their down payment. $50,000 plus interest. It's all documented and legally binding. Sterling's face went pale as he recognized his father's signature on the papers. "Dad said that was a gift." "No, Sterling. Your father was very clear that it was a loan. He just never pressed you for repayment because he loved you and wanted to help you build a life." I paused, letting that sink in. "But the terms of the loan allowed for immediate collection if circumstances warranted it." "What circumstances?" Sterling's voice was barely above a whisper. "Oh, I think you know." I looked directly at Zariah, whose green eyes were now blazing with fury. "Perhaps you should ask your wife about the folder she keeps in the home office, the one with all her notes about my supposed incompetence and her plans to have me institutionalized." Zariah's face went white. "You went through my private papers?" "I went through papers in a house where I was supposedly living as family, papers that documented your plan to have me declared mentally incompetent and committed to an assisted living facility by Christmas." Sterling turned to stare at his wife. "Is that true?" Zariah's mouth opened and closed soundlessly. I continued, my voice steady and clear. "I found the correspondence with Willowbrook, the appointment you scheduled with Dr. Patterson, and all your careful notes about my alleged confusion and forgetfulness. Very thorough documentation, Zariah. Almost like you were building a legal case." "Mom," Sterling said desperately, "surely we can work this out. If there was a misunderstanding..." There was no misunderstanding, I interrupted. Your wife wanted me out of the way so she could control the narrative about my competence and my care. She wanted to lock me in that tiny room until she could justify locking me away permanently. I handed him an envelope through the taxi window. Your share of the sale proceeds, minus the loan repayment and legal fees. $73,000. It should be enough for a security deposit on a new place. Sterling took the envelope with shaking hands. Where are you going to live? I smiled at him then, feeling lighter than I had in months. Wherever I choose. That's the beauty of being a competent adult with her own resources. As the taxi pulled away, I saw Zariah sink onto the curb, her expensive shopping bags scattered around her like the remnants of a shattered dream. Sterling stood over her, still holding the envelope, finally understanding exactly what kind of woman he'd married and what she'd tried to do to his mother. I didn't feel sorry for either of them. For the first time in weeks, I felt exactly what I was, a 60-year-old woman with options, resources, and the strength to use both. The taxi driver glanced at me in the rearview mirror. Where to, ma'am? I smiled as I gave him the address of the extended stay hotel where I'd already booked a suite. Tomorrow I would start looking for a new home, something small and perfect, with enough space for a proper bedroom and a kitchen where I could cook whenever I wanted. Tonight I would sleep in a real bed in a room with windows that opened, and I would plan the rest of my life on my own terms. The explosion came exactly 18 hours after I'd sold their house. I was sitting in my hotel suite, enjoying a room service breakfast and reading the newspaper in blessed silence, when my phone began ringing. Sterling's number appeared on the screen repeatedly, 5 calls in 10 minutes. I let them all go to voicemail. When the call stopped, the text messages began. Mom, please call me back. We need to talk. This is insane. You can't just sell someone's house without telling them. Zariah is having a breakdown. She won't stop crying. I deleted each message without responding. Let them panic. Let them scramble. Let them feel exactly as helpless and displaced as they'd made me feel. At noon, there was a knock at my hotel room door. I looked through the peephole and saw Sterling standing in the hallway, his hair disheveled, his clothes wrinkled like he'd slept in them. He looked like he'd aged 5 years overnight. I opened the door, but didn't invite him in. Mom. His voice was hoarse. We need to talk. I think we've said everything that needs saying. Please, just, let me explain. I studied his face, the son I'd raised, the boy I'd worked double shifts to support, the man who'd stood by while his wife systematically humiliated me. 5 minutes? I stepped aside and let him enter. He looked around the spacious hotel suite with its king-size bed, sitting area, and kitchenette, all the space and comfort I'd been denied in his home. Mom, I had no idea what Zariah was planning with the doctor evaluation. I swear to you, I didn't know about any institutionalization plans. But you knew about the folder. He flinched. What folder? The one where your wife documented every supposed sign of my incompetence. The one with brochures for assisted living facilities and notes about my confusion and forgetfulness. Sterling sank into one of the hotel chairs, his head in his hands. I never saw any folder. But you agreed I was becoming confused. You agreed I needed supervision and restrictions. She said you were having trouble adjusting, that you seemed disoriented, that you'd asked the same questions multiple times. I was worried about you. I felt a cold laugh bubble up in my throat. And it never occurred to you to ask me directly how I was feeling? To spend 5 minutes alone with me to assess my mental state yourself? He trailed off, probably realizing there was no good answer to that question. Your wife is a master manipulator, Sterling. She told you exactly what you needed to hear to justify treating me like a burden who needed managing. And you believed her because it was easier than acknowledging what was really happening. What was really happening? She wanted me out of the way. She wanted control over my resources and my care decisions. That tiny room, those bathroom schedules, the isolation from my grandchildren, it was all designed to make me appear incompetent and dependent. Sterling's face was pale. She wouldn't. Zariah isn't like that. Isn't she? I walked to my laptop and pulled up the photos I'd taken of her folder. Would you like to see the evidence? For the next 10 minutes, I showed him everything: the notes about my supposed decline, the correspondence with care facilities, the consultation with Dr. Patterson, the timeline that would have had me institutionalized by Christmas. Sterling stared at the screen in growing horror. "I don't understand," he whispered. "Why would she do this? Because she could. Because she thought I was powerless to stop her. Because she underestimated exactly who she was dealing with." Sterling looked up at me with something that might have been recognition dawning in his eyes. "You're not confused at all, are you? You never were. I'm 60 years old, not 90. I buried my husband and sold my house and moved across town to live with family who claimed to love me. I was grieving and adjusting to change, but I was never incompetent. God, Mom, I'm so sorry. I should have seen it. I should have protected you." "Yes, you should have. But you chose to trust your wife's version of reality instead of your own observations. You chose to believe I was the problem instead of looking at what she was doing to me." We sat in silence for several moments. Finally, Sterling spoke again. "What can I do to fix this?" "You can't. Some things once broken can't be repaired." "But I'm your son. I love you." I looked at him, really looked at him, and saw not the successful businessman or devoted husband, but the little boy I'd raised. The child who'd always been easily influenced, who'd always sought approval from the strongest personality in the room. "I know you love me, Sterling, in your way, but love without respect, love without trust, that's not enough anymore." My phone buzzed with a text message. We both glanced at it automatically. It was from Zariah. "Tell your crazy mother that legal theft is still theft. We're going to sue her for everything she has." Sterling's face flushed with embarrassment. "Mom, she's just upset. She doesn't mean—" "Sterling." I held up my hand to stop him. "Your wife just called me crazy and threatened to sue me for recovering a legitimate debt that your father documented 8 years ago. Do you see the pattern here?" Before he could answer, my phone rang. Sterling's number, but when I answered, it was Zariah's voice on the line. "You think you're so smart, don't you?" Her voice was shrill, barely controlled. "You think you've won something?" "Zariah, where are you?" Sterling asked, alarmed. "I'm in the hotel lobby. Security wouldn't let me up without permission." She laughed, a bitter sound. "Apparently, even here, I need to ask permission to see my own mother-in-law." "Tell security to send her up," I said to Sterling. "It's time we had a proper conversation." 5 minutes later, Zariah burst through my hotel room door like a hurricane. Her usually perfect hair was pulled back in a messy ponytail, her makeup was smeared, and she was wearing the same clothes from the day before. "You destroyed my life," she said without preamble. "You took my home, my security, everything I worked for." "I took nothing that belonged to you," I replied calmly. "I recovered money that belonged to my husband's estate and exercised legal rights that you didn't know existed." "That's bullshit and you know it. You did this because you're bitter and jealous." "Jealous of what?" "Of me. Of my marriage, my life, my relationship with Sterling. You couldn't stand that he chose me over you." I felt something snap inside me. "Your relationship with Sterling? You mean the one where you manipulate him into believing his own mother is incompetent? Where you isolate him from his family and convince him that love means control? I protected him from you. You're a needy, demanding old woman who would have consumed his entire life if I hadn't set boundaries." "Boundaries?" I repeated the word like it tasted bitter. "Is that what you call locking me in a room smaller than most people's closets? Making me ask permission to use the bathroom? Keeping me away from my own grandchildren?" Sterling was staring at his wife as if seeing her for the first time. "Zariah, you said Mom preferred the smaller room. You said she felt more secure there." Zariah's composure cracked completely. "She did. She never complained, never said she was unhappy. If she had a problem with the arrangements, she should have spoken up." "How could I speak up?" I asked. "Every time I expressed a preference or made a request, you found a way to make it about my age, my supposed confusion, my inability to adapt to the way things work here. You gaslighted me so thoroughly that I started questioning my own perceptions. That's ridiculous. I was nothing but kind to you. Kind. I pulled out my phone and scrolled through the photos I'd taken. Let me read you some of your own notes about me. R shows signs of confusion, forgetfulness. Neighbors concerned about ability to live independently. S agrees intervention necessary. Zariah's face went white. I continued reading. R, adapting well to structured environment, responds positively to clear boundaries and limited decision-making responsibilities. May be ready for next phase by Christmas. What's the next phase? Sterling asked, his voice deadly quiet. Tell him, Zariah. Tell your husband what you were planning for his mother. Zariah's mouth opened and closed soundlessly. Fine, I'll tell him. I looked directly at Sterling. Your wife was building a case to have me declared incompetent and committed to an assisted living facility. She'd already contacted Willowbrook and put me on their waiting list. She'd scheduled a home evaluation with a doctor who specializes in finding reasons to institutionalize elderly people. That's not... I was just exploring options, Zariah stammered, in case you needed more care than we could provide. I needed more care? My voice rose for the first time. I needed to be treated like a human being instead of a problem to be managed. I needed my son to acknowledge that I was still a competent adult who deserved basic respect and dignity. Sterling stood up abruptly, his face flushed with anger. You were going to have my mother committed without telling me? I was protecting our family. From what? From my 60-year-old mother who was grieving her husband and trying to rebuild her life? From her taking over our lives? From her becoming our responsibility for the next 20 years? Zariah's mask finally slipped completely. I didn't sign up to be a caregiver for your needy mother. I married you, not her. The silence that followed was deafening. Sterling stared at his wife as if she were a stranger. There it is, I said quietly. The truth. You saw me as a burden from the moment I moved in. Every rule, every restriction, every small cruelty, it was all designed to make me so miserable that I'd beg to be placed somewhere else. That's not true, Zariah protested weakly. Isn't it? Then explain the bathroom schedule. Explain why I couldn't eat breakfast in the kitchen or spend time with my grandchildren. Explain why you documented every moment of supposed confusion while creating conditions designed to make me feel confused and powerless. Zariah looked between Sterling and me, realizing that her carefully constructed narrative was collapsing. You don't understand the pressure I was under. Having an elderly person in the house, worrying about her safety, her needs. Stop! Sterling's voice cut through her excuses. Just stop talking. He turned to me, his face full of something I hadn't seen in years. Respect. Mom, I owe you the biggest apology of my life. I let her convince me that you were the problem when she was the one creating problems. I should have trusted my own judgment. I should have protected you. Yes, I said simply. You should have. Zariah made one last desperate attempt to regain control. Sterling, you can't believe her over me. I'm your wife. We're supposed to be a team. Sterling looked at her for a long moment. A team doesn't systematically abuse one member's mother and then lie about it. A team doesn't make plans to institutionalize someone without discussing it first. I was doing what was best for everyone. No, Sterling said firmly. You were doing what was best for you. And you know what? You got exactly what you deserved. Zariah's face crumpled, but this time I didn't feel even a flicker of sympathy. She'd shown me no mercy when she'd held all the power. She planned to lock me away and throw away the key, all while convincing my son that it was for my own good. We're done here, I said, moving toward the door. You both need to leave. Sterling nodded, but Zariah wasn't finished. You'll regret this, she said, her voice low and venomous. When you're old and sick and alone, when you need help and have no one to call, you'll remember this day and regret destroying your family. I looked at her one last time, this woman who'd tried so hard to erase me from my own son's life. Zariah, I said calmly, I was already old, sick, and alone when I lived in your house. The difference is, now I'm free. As they left my hotel room, I heard them arguing in the hallway. Sterling's voice angry and betrayed, Zariah's desperate and defensive. Their marriage was imploding, and while I took no joy in that destruction, I felt no guilt about it either. Some relationships deserve to end. Some people needed to face the consequences of their choices, and some 60-year-old women needed to remember that they still had fight left in them. 6 months later, I was sitting in my own kitchen, in my own house, drinking coffee from my own favorite mug and watching the sunrise through windows that I could open whenever I pleased. The house was a small craftsman bungalow about 20 minutes from where Sterling and Zariah used to live. 2 bedrooms, 1 bathroom, and a kitchen big enough for a proper dining table. It was perfect. I'd bought it with cash 3 weeks after selling Sterling's house, paying $215,000 for a place that felt like home the moment I walked through the front door. The previous owners had been an elderly couple who'd maintained it beautifully, and it came with a garden full of roses and a screened porch where I could sit in the evenings. For the first time in decades, I was living entirely on my own terms. My phone buzzed with a text message. Sterling had been trying to contact me regularly since that confrontation at the hotel, but our communications were brief and careful. "Mom, would you like to have lunch today?" My treat. I considered the message while I finished my coffee. We'd met 3 times since that awful day, always in neutral locations, always with the understanding that our relationship was being rebuilt from scratch. He was trying, I'd give him that. But trust, once broken so completely, doesn't repair quickly. I texted back, "Okay, that cafe on Maple Street, 1 o'clock. The divorce had been finalized 2 months ago. According to Sterling, Zariah had fought it bitterly at first, demanding half of everything and claiming that I had manipulated the situation to destroy their marriage. But when the court reviewed the evidence, including her own documented plans to have me institutionalized, the judge had been less than sympathetic to her claims. She'd received a small settlement and had moved back to her hometown in Oregon. I'd heard through mutual acquaintances that she was telling everyone who would listen that she'd been the victim of a vindictive mother-in-law who couldn't stand to see her son happy. Let her tell that story. The people who mattered knew the truth. I arrived at the cafe a few minutes early and chose a table by the window. When Sterling walked in, I was struck by how different he looked. Thinner, with gray threading through his hair that hadn't been there 6 months ago. The stress of the divorce and the revelation about Zariah's true nature had aged him, but there was something else, a clarity in his eyes that hadn't been there before. "You look good, Mom," he said as he sat down across from me. "Happy." "I am happy." We ordered lunch, soup and sandwiches, nothing fancy, and for a few minutes we talked about safe topics. My new house, his work, the weather. But eventually, as always, we came to the real conversation. "I've been thinking about what you said," Sterling began, stirring his soup without eating it. "About love without respect not being enough." I waited. "You were right. I thought providing for you, giving you a place to live, making sure you were safe, I thought that was love. But I never asked what you wanted. I never considered that you might have your own opinions about how you wanted to live." "No, you didn't." "Zariah made it seem like you were fragile, like you needed protection from making bad decisions. She said older people often don't realize when they're declining, and that it was our responsibility to step in before something bad happened." I set down my spoon and looked at him directly. "Sterling, I want you to hear this clearly. At no point in the last year was I declining mentally or physically. I was grieving my husband of 42 years and adjusting to a major life change, but I was never incompetent or confused. Your wife lied to you about my condition so you would support her plan to control me. I see that now, but at the time it seemed like she was being caring and responsible. She was being manipulative and cruel. There's a difference." Sterling nodded, but I could see him struggling with the reality of what he'd allowed to happen. "How do I make this right?" It was the question he'd been asking for months, and I'd finally figured out the answer. "You can't make it right," I said gently. "What happened can't be undone. But you can decide who you want to be going forward." "What do you mean?" "I mean, you can choose to learn from this. You can choose to think for yourself instead of letting someone else define reality for you. You can choose to treat people, including me, as individuals with their own agency instead of problems to be managed. Sterling was quiet for a long time, processing what I'd said. Do you think you'll ever forgive me? He asked finally. I considered the question carefully. I forgive you for being deceived, Sterling. Zariah is very good at manipulation, and she convinced you that her cruelty was actually kindness. But I don't forgive you for not thinking for yourself, for not spending 5 minutes alone with me to form your own opinion about my mental state. That's fair. And I don't forgive you for standing by while she treated me like a burden instead of a person. You watched her isolate me from my grandchildren, confine me to a tiny room, and restrict my basic freedoms, and you said nothing. Sterling's eyes filled with tears. I was so wrong. Yes, you were. But the question now is, what are you going to do differently? We finished our lunch in relative silence, both of us lost in our own thoughts. As we prepared to leave, Sterling handed me an envelope. What's this? Photos of Emma and Jake from their spring break trip. I thought you might like to see them. I opened the envelope and found myself looking at pictures of my grandchildren, Emma, now 11, grinning gap-toothed in front of a beach. Jake, 8, building an elaborate sandcastle. They looked happy and healthy and completely unaware of the family drama that had unfolded around them. How are they handling the divorce? Better than I expected. Their mother has been good about not bad-mouthing Zariah, and I've tried to keep things stable for them. They ask about you sometimes. My heart clenched. What do you tell them? The truth. That Grandma Ramona has her own house now, and that grown-ups sometimes make mistakes that hurt the people they love. I studied the photos, memorizing the changes in their faces since I'd last seen them. I'd like to see them again sometime. When you think they're ready. They're ready now. They've been asking when they can visit your new house. I felt something warm unfold in my chest. Really? Really? Emma wants to know if you still have those chocolate chip cookie recipes you used to make, and Jake wants to show you the rock collection he started. For the first time in months, I felt the tight knot of hurt in my chest begin to loosen. My grandchildren remembered me. They wanted to see me. Whatever else Zariah had destroyed, she hadn't been able to erase my relationship with Emma and Jake. Tell them they can come visit next weekend if they want. I'll make cookies. Sterling smiled, the first genuine smile I'd seen from him since this whole ordeal began. They'll love that. As we parted ways in the parking lot, Sterling hesitated. Mom, I know I don't deserve it, but I hope someday we can have a real relationship again. Not the kind we had before where I took you for granted, but something honest and respectful. I looked at my son, this middle-aged man who was finally learning that love meant more than providing basic necessities and making decisions for other people. I hope so too, I said. But it has to be on equal terms. I'm not the helpless widow who needs managing. I'm a competent adult who happens to be your mother. I understand. Do you? Because I live in my own house now, Sterling. I pay my own bills, make my own decisions, and live my life according to my own preferences. I'm not moving back in with you or anyone else. I'm not giving up my independence for the illusion of security. I wouldn't ask you to. I studied his face, looking for signs of the man who had stood by while his wife systematically humiliated me. What I saw instead was someone who had learned a hard lesson about the difference between love and control. All right, then. We'll see how it goes. That evening, I sat on my screened porch with a glass of wine and Harold's photo, watching the sun set over my garden. The roses were in full bloom, filling the air with their sweet fragrance. We did good, Harold, I said to the photo. You protected me even after you were gone, and I protected myself when I had to. My phone buzzed with a text from Emma. Grandma, Dad says we can visit you next weekend. Can we really make cookies? I smiled as I typed back, Of course, sweetheart. We'll make whatever kind you want. Another text appeared immediately. Can we make the ones with the chocolate chips and the nuts? Those were always my favorite. Those were always my favorite, too. I'll get everything ready. As the stars began to appear in the darkening sky, I reflected on the journey that had brought me to this moment. 6 months ago, I'd been a prisoner in my own son's house, slowly disappearing under the weight of someone else's agenda for my life. I'd been treated like a problem to be solved rather than a person to be respected. Now I was sitting in my own home, planning cookie baking sessions with grandchildren who missed me, rebuilding a relationship with my son on my own terms. I had my dignity back, my independence back, and my sense of self back. The money from Harold's estate was safely invested, providing me with a comfortable income. The house was mine, bought and paid for. I had no debt, no obligations to anyone except those I chose to honor. Most importantly, I had learned something valuable about my own strength. I discovered that even at 60, even after being systematically diminished and controlled, I still had the power to fight back. I still had the courage to demand better treatment and the wisdom to recognize manipulation when I saw it. Zariah had tried to erase me, to make me disappear into the margins of my own family's life. She'd failed completely. I was more visible now, more present, more myself than I'd been in years. My phone rang, interrupting my thoughts. It was Janet from the bank. "Mrs. Mitchell, I hope I'm not calling too late. I have some good news about your investment portfolio." "Not too late at all. What's the news?" "The market performance has been excellent this quarter. Your accounts have grown by about 8%. At this rate, you'll be very comfortable financially for years to come." I smiled, thinking about Zariah's prediction that I'd end up old, sick, and alone with no one to call for help. She'd been wrong about everything. "That's wonderful news, Janet. Thank you for calling." After I hung up, I raised my wine glass in a small toast to the gathering darkness. "To freedom," I said aloud, "to dignity, and to never again letting anyone make me feel small." The evening breeze rustled through the roses, carrying their perfume across the porch where I sat in perfect contentment. Tomorrow I would start planning cookies and rock collections and all the grandmother activities I'd been denied for so long. Tonight I would simply enjoy the peace of a life reclaimed and a future that belonged entirely to me. I was 60 years old and I was finally completely free. Now I'm curious about you who listened to my story. What would you do if you were in my place? Have you ever been through something similar? Comment below, and meanwhile, I'm leaving on the final screen 2 other stories that are channel favorites, and they will definitely surprise you. Thank you for watching until here.